Deep in a Congolese mine, a headlamp sweeps across the rock, and for a glinting second, raw cobalt answers back, silver against black stone. A hand reaches in, claws it free, and the journey begins. That rock reaches the surface already changed, a commodity now, weighed, crated, loaded into a midnight convoy. Floodlights carving shadows down a road built for a port the miner will never see. Follow those tire tracks backward into the hills, and the light tells another story. No floodlights, no power grid, only a candle burning low in a tin roof shack. 2 roads, 2 lives, both leading back to the same soil. Congo. The beating heart of Africa, sitting on the richest ground the world has ever measured. So what does it take to survive on top of the world's greatest treasure? Before sunrise in Kolwezi, the ground is already moving. Headlamps bob in loose lines down red earthen slopes, small constellations disappearing into tunnels barely wide enough for a shoulder. This is where roughly 70% of the world's cobalt begins its journey. Not from a factory, but from hand tools and headlamps, dug out by people who will likely never own the devices this mineral eventually powers. Congo's mining sector has grown fast. In recent years, the country's extractive industry expanded by double digits, driven largely by copper and cobalt. Katanga's mines sit atop deposits so vast that geologists have struggled to fully map them, and the government has gone so far as to pause cobalt exports entirely, then reintroduce them under strict quotas, simply to control how much of this wealth reaches the market at once. A country regulating the flow of its own treasure, the way a dam regulates a river. For Kasongo, that treasure looks like a sack of gray rock slung over his shoulder. He has worked this slope for 6 years. He knows which tunnels flood after rain and which ones cave without warning. He knows the weight of a full sack, the ache that settles into his lower back by early afternoon, and the price a middleman will offer before Kasongo even sets the sack down. That price rarely reflects what happens to the mineral next. The rest of that value travels somewhere Kasongo will never follow. From Kasongo's hands, the cobalt moves to a buying post, then to a processing facility, much of it eventually refined through companies with ties to China, before crossing oceans toward factories that will turn it into something sleek and expensive. Somewhere along that chain, value multiplies by hundreds. Kasongo will never see that multiplication. He will see the same buying post tomorrow and the day after. Executives elsewhere call this a supply chain. Kasongo calls it Tuesday. At the buying post, a scale groans under the weight of the morning's haul. A supervisor scribbles numbers into a ledger without looking up. Nobody here negotiates. The price was set somewhere else, by someone Kasongo has never met, in a currency he rarely handles directly. His 14-year-old nephew works 2 slopes over. Congolese law technically allows light work from age 15, but enforcement in the informal mining belt is thin, and hunger has its own timeline. Half the children mining cobalt across the region, according to labor researchers, are doing work far heavier than light, the kind that means hauling, digging, and breathing dust in tunnels that were never engineered to hold a body, let alone collapse safely around one. Kasongo doesn't talk about his nephew easily. He glances toward that slope, then back at his own hands, cracked and pale with mineral dust along the knuckle lines. What makes this arrangement so difficult to untangle is that it isn't hidden. Trucks loaded with ore roll openly past checkpoints. Export figures appear in government reports. Everyone can see the wealth leaving. What's harder to see is where, exactly, it stops helping the people who pulled it from the ground. Congo's economy has technically grown. Mining alone expanded sharply in recent years, and officials point to rising GDP as proof of progress. But growth measured in national statistics and growth felt inside a household in Kolwezi are, it turns out, two very different currencies. Above ground, the scale of it all is easy to miss because it never announces itself. There is no single gate marked wealth, no ribbon-cutting ceremony for a truckload of ore. It simply leaves, day after day, the way water leaves a cracked basin, quietly and constantly, until one day the basin is empty and nobody can quite say when that happened. So the question returns, quieter this time: if this ground is worth trillions, why does the man digging it still calculate his day in single dollars? Downriver from Kinshasa, the paint has mostly peeled from the old colonial buildings of Boma. Vines have started reclaiming what was once considered the administrative heart of a European empire's most profitable possession. Boma was the first capital of what colonizers once called the Congo Free State, a name that, in practice, described almost nothing free about it. For decades, this port shipped out rubber and ivory under a system so brutal that it eventually drew international condemnation, forcing a change in ownership, but not, in any meaningful sense, a change in purpose. The ships kept leaving full. The people who filled them kept receiving almost nothing in return. Etienne has lived 2 streets from the old governor's residence his entire life. His grandmother used to point at the crumbling facade and tell him stories passed down from her own mother. Stories about forced quotas, about villages punished for falling short, about a system built to extract rather than to build. He tells those same stories now to his grandchildren, standing in roughly the same spot. Glancing up at the faded stonework, he says the building changed hands, but the road out of the country never did. Independence, when it finally came, promised to change exactly that. Independence arrived in 1960, and with it came a wave of hope so large it briefly reshaped the sound of an entire continent. But hope did not dismantle the extraction machine so much as inherit it. Decades under Mobutu Sese Seko followed, then 2 devastating regional wars that pulled in nearly a dozen neighboring nations, each one, in some form, drawn by what lay beneath Congolese soil. 1. Etienne remembers the day the flag changed for the second time in his life. How neighbors carried radios into the street to listen for news that never quite matched what they hoped to hear. He remembers, too, how quickly the excitement of independence gave way to something familiar, New names on old export documents, new signatures authorizing the same shipments out. Etienne isn't a historian. He's a retired dock worker who happens to live inside a timeline most textbooks compress into a single paragraph. For him, history isn't behind glass. It's the building at the end of his street, still standing, still watching the river carry things away. The road Kasongo's cobalt travels today, it turns out, isn't a new road at all. It's the same one Boma's rubber and ivory once followed, only updated and digitized now, still running in exactly the same direction. By 7 in the morning, Kinshasa is already loud. Motorbike taxis weave between stalled trucks, drivers shouting fares over engine noise. Vendors balance woven trays of bread on their heads, stepping between puddles left from last night's rain. Somewhere beneath all of it, the low churn of the Congo River keeps its own rhythm, unbothered by the city built along its banks. Home to roughly 17 million people, Kinshasa has become one of the fastest-growing cities on the continent, expanding faster than its roads, its power grid, or its water systems can keep pace with. Thousands of small, improvised ones do instead. Most of its economy runs informally, through a vast, improvised network of small trades, side hustles, and daily hustling that official statistics barely capture. Along Boulevard Lumumba, a mechanic sets up his tools on the sidewalk each morning, unofficial and unbothered by it, because in Kinshasa, the line between formal and informal work has mostly dissolved. He fixes what he can, charges what the customer can pay, and packs everything away again by dusk. Multiply him by hundreds of thousands, and you begin to understand how a city this size keeps functioning without the infrastructure that would, on paper, be required to support it. Downriver, life slows into a different tempo. Jean-Pierre has piloted a wooden pirogue along the Congo River for 11 years, ferrying sacks of cassava, crates of fish, and the occasional passenger between riverside villages and the nearest market town. His boat has no motor. His arms do the work an engine would elsewhere. Resting his paddle across his knees for a moment, he says simply that the river doesn't care whether you're tired, before pushing off again. His daughter waits for him most evenings at the muddy edge of the water, watching for the particular shape of her father's boat among a dozen identical silhouettes. She has learned to recognize it by the way it sits slightly lower on the left side. Between the roar of Kinshasa's traffic and the quiet strain of Jean-Pierre's paddle lies the same country, somehow holding both speeds at once, a capital racing forward alongside a river that has never needed to rush. It is worth remembering, watching him paddle past the same red clay banks that once loaded rubber onto colonial steamers, that this river has always been Congo's main road. Kings, soldiers, missionaries, and traders moved along it long before the mining trucks ever existed. Jean-Pierre didn't inherit a metaphor, he inherited a route. Emerging from a narrow alley in Matange, a man in a tailored mustard yellow suit adjusts his pocket square with the unhurried precision of someone stepping onto a runway rather than a dirt path lined with open drains. His name is Bijou. His neighbors know him simply as one of the Sapeurs. The Société des Ambianceurs et des Personnes Élégantes, usually shortened to SAP, began nearly a century ago as a quiet form of resistance under colonial rule, when dressing with deliberate, excessive elegance became a way for Congolese men to reclaim dignity the system tried to strip from them. The tradition never left. If anything, it sharpened. Bijou owns 4 suits. 2 are, by his own estimate, worth more than several months of his income. He will not say exactly how he affords them, only that a sapeur finds a way. Every weekend, he and a small circle of friends stage what they call a défi, essentially an elegance duel, held on the same cracked sidewalks where they grew up. Passers-by stop. Children mimic their poses from a distance. For a few hours, the street becomes something closer to a stage than a slum. Smoothing his lapel, Bijou explains that people look at where they live and decide who they are before they ever speak, so he and the others choose to speak first, through their clothes. But why would anyone go into debt for a suit in a neighborhood like this one? It is tempting to read the Sapeurs as pure spectacle, color set against poverty, contrast for its own sake. But look closer, and something else is happening. In a country where more than 200 ethnic groups coexist, where Lingala carries the rhythm of the capital's streets, style has become one of the few things Congolese people fully control. No mining company sets the terms, no foreign buyer negotiates the price. It is theirs, stitched and worn on their own bodies, on their own schedule. Inside Bijou's home, the suits hang on a single metal rod, wrapped carefully in plastic against the humidity. His wife irons the shirts by hand, holding each one up to the light before deciding it's ready. There's a small ritual to it, the pressing, the checking, the adjusting, that has nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with respect, both for the clothes and for whoever will see them worn. Bijou's grandfather was a sapeur, so, most likely, will be his son. Turning to walk back down the alley, suit catching the afternoon light, he says they can take the minerals. They cannot take the way he walks. Past midnight in Matange, a 7-piece band works through its second set. Guitars braided together in long, unhurried solos that seem to have no interest in ending. This is rumba, the sound most Congolese people will tell you belongs to them the way a fingerprint belongs to a hand. What turned a dance born from pain into a nation's proudest export is a story that starts, of all places, in a colonial negotiating room. In 2021, UNESCO formally recognized Congolese rumba as intangible cultural heritage, a genre born from an older dance called nkumba, layered over decades with rhythms carried across the Atlantic and back through Cuban recordings. By the 1950s, it had become the soundtrack of a movement. When Congolese delegates traveled to Brussels to negotiate independence, a band went with them, and the song they recorded there, Independance Cha-Cha, turned a diplomatic footnote into an anthem sung across a continent, shedding its colonizers one nation at a time. 2 rival bands defined that early era. Franco Luambo's OK Jazz spoke, through long guitar solos called sebenes, to the working class filling Kinshasa's factories and docks. Joseph Kabasele's African jazz, more polished, drew the capital's students and intellectuals. Different crowds, different tempos, same river of sound running underneath both. 60-some years later, Albert still takes the stage most weekends, guitar slung low, voice roughened by decades of smoke-filled rooms. Between sets, wiping sweat from his forehead with a folded cloth, he says that when he was young, this music carried their freedom. Now, he says, it carries their memory. A short walk from the club, a small museum occupies the former home of Papa Wemba, one of Rumba's most towering figures. Vinyl records line glass cases. Photographs of packed stadiums hang beside faded stage costumes. The museum's assistant director worries openly that younger listeners, drawn to newer Afropop fusions, may let the older sound fade, which is, in part, why the museum exists at all. An attempt to keep a nation's memory from dissolving into the next trend. Back at the club, the crowd doesn't seem worried about any of that. They are simply dancing, the way people here have danced through independence, through dictatorship, through war, and through whatever tomorrow happens to bring. Outside, a group of teenagers huddle around a phone speaker, listening to a newer Afropop track built loosely on Rumba's old bones. They may never set foot in the museum down the street, but the guitar pattern threading through their song, whether they know it or not, traces back to the same Sabines Franco once played for dock workers a lifetime ago. The same soil that yields cobalt beneath Kolwezi yields something else entirely here, a sound that no export quota can regulate and no buyer can underprice. Mist clings low over the slopes of Virunga at dawn, thick enough to blur the line between forest and sky. Somewhere inside it, a mountain gorilla shifts its weight, unhurried, chewing a fistful of wild celery while 3 younger gorillas tumble nearby. Virunga shelters roughly 600 of the world's remaining mountain gorillas, more than half the global population, gathered in a single, fragile pocket of forest. Custody of that pocket falls, in practice, to men like Baraka. He has worked as a ranger here for 9 years, tracking gorilla families through terrain that shifts, without warning, from tourist trail to active conflict zone. Keeping that population alive comes with a cost rarely mentioned alongside the park's postcard beauty. North Kivu has spent much of the past decade under the shadow of armed groups, and Virunga's rangers have paid that price directly. More than 200 have been killed in the line of duty since the park's modern conservation effort began. Adjusting the strap of his radio, Baraka says, people often ask why he keeps doing this job. His answer is always the same question, turned back on them. What happens to this forest if he stops? He has buried 3 colleagues over the years. He keeps a photo of the most recent one folded inside his uniform pocket, not out of ceremony, he says, but because it's easier to carry the weight that way than to leave it behind at the station. A few kilometers away, Nyiragongo's crater holds one of the only permanent lava lakes on Earth, glowing a deep, restless orange after dark, visible from villages that have learned to read its temperament the way sailors read weather. Deeper still into the Ituri forest, a sheer animal lives entirely within Congo's borders and nowhere else on the planet, an okapi, its striped hindquarters making it look, at first glance, like something assembled from 2 different animals. Scientists once believed it might be mythical. It very nearly is, rare enough that most Congolese people have never seen one outside a photograph. For families settled along the edges of Virunga, the forest is neither postcard nor abstraction. It is grazing land, competing with gorilla habitat, fish stock, competing with conservation boundaries, a daily negotiation between feeding a household and protecting something the rest of the world has decided is priceless. Solange fishes the shallows of Lake Kivu most mornings, close enough to the park boundary that she can hear the calls of colobus monkeys carrying over the water. She supports 4 children on what the lake gives her. Some seasons it gives generously. Others, not enough, and the forest's edge starts to look less like a boundary line and more like a resource she isn't permitted to touch. Baraka finishes his patrol as the mist begins lifting off the canopy, revealing, for a moment, the full weight of what he is guarding and what it might cost to keep guarding it. By late afternoon, the smell of Mwambe chicken drifts through the market stalls of central Kinshasa, thick with palm nut sauce simmering low over open flame. Mireille has sold produce at this same stall for 15 years. Cassava roots stacked in dusty pyramids, plantains bundled with twine, chili peppers sorted by heat into careful rows. Cassava remains the backbone of most Congolese meals, ground into fufu, pounded, boiled, endlessly adapted, endlessly present. Whatever holds a family like hers together, it isn't money, not most nights. Tonight, like most nights, her extended family will gather around a single shared pot. 9 people, 1 dish. No individual plates until the last moment. Wrapping a bundle of greens for a customer, Mireille says food here is never eaten alone, that even when there isn't much, there's always enough to share. Her youngest daughter stirs the pot now, old enough to be trusted with the wooden spoon, but still young enough to sneak a taste before it's ready. Mireille lets her, the way her own mother once let her. For a few hours each evening, the noise of the city softens into something smaller, just the scrape of spoons, the low murmur of family conversation, a brief and ordinary peace before tomorrow's hustle resumes. From a distance, the camp looks almost like a second city, rows of tarpaulin roofs stretching toward the horizon, smoke rising from hundreds of small cooking fires. Up close, it is something else entirely. Congo's eastern provinces have endured one of the world's largest displacement crises, with more than 7 million people forced from their homes by an armed conflict that has simmered, flared, and simmered again for over 2 decades. The roots of that conflict trace back to regional tensions following the 1994 Rwandan genocide, but its fuel today is unmistakably mineral. Control over coltan, gold, and cobalt-rich territory has kept dozens of armed groups active across North and South Kivu. Chantal fled her village outside Goma with her 3 children 18 months ago, carrying what fit into 2 bags and leaving behind a house she and her husband had built themselves over 12 years. She does not describe the day she left in detail. She describes, instead, what came after, learning to cook for 4 people on a single fire shared with 6 other families, teaching her youngest to read, using a torn schoolbook someone else no longer needed, and still waiting for word about relatives who stayed behind. More than 100 armed groups now operate across eastern Congo, some fighting over ideology, most fighting, in one way or another, over ground, the same ground that happens to sit atop the coltan and gold deposits feeding global supply chains. Peacekeeping mandates get renewed. Ceasefires get signed, then broken within weeks. Chantal has stopped tracking the news cycle closely. She tracks, instead, whether her children ate today. Watching her son chase a homemade wire toy between the tents, she says quietly that she isn't asking for the ground to be worth less. She is only asking for it to help her family the way it helps everyone else. Her question sits uncomfortably close to the one that opened this film. Trillions of dollars in mineral wealth extracted year after year, and still, less than a day's drive from some of the country's richest mines, families sleep under tarpaulin because the place they called home became too dangerous to stay. If Congo's ground has given the world so much, the camps stretching across North Kivu ask the same thing Kasongo asked back in Kolwezi, just from a different angle. Given all of that, why does so little of it return? As evening settles back over Matong, string lights flicker on above the same alley where Bijou straightened his mustard yellow suit earlier in this story. He's back, this time with his son trailing a half step behind, already practicing the unhurried walk his father taught him. Ask people here why they stay, through blackouts, through shortages, through a national wealth that rarely trickles down to street level, and the answers rarely mention economics at all. The wealth never really came home. Something else did. Instead, they mention family. They mention rhythm. They mention a music that has survived colonization, dictatorship, and war without losing its beat. Albert, the guitarist from the Matong Club, puts it simply after his last set of the night. This ground raised him, and whatever else happens to it, he belongs to it first. There is a version of Congo defined entirely by extraction, measured in tonnage, in trade routes, in numbers on a mining ledger. And there is another Congo, the one lived daily by Bijou, by Jean-Pierre on his pirogue, by Mireille at her market stall, by Baraka walking his patrol at dawn, by Chantal rebuilding a routine out of almost nothing near Goma. This is a Congo, held together not by what leaves the ground, but by what people choose to build on top of it anyway. So, where did it all go? Some of it sits in refined form inside batteries and circuit boards scattered across continents that will likely never see the tunnels of Kolwezi or the camps outside Goma. Some of it moves through ledgers and export quotas, shifting hands long before it could ever reach a household like Chantal's. The honest answer is unglamorous. Much of it simply left, the way it has been leaving for over a century, following the same river mouth exit Boma watched ships take generations ago. But not everything left. What remains is harder to price. It's in the deliberate elegance of a tailored suit worn down a muddy alley, in a river captain's ability to read water with his arms instead of an engine, in a song that turned a colony's negotiation for freedom into a nation's most enduring anthem. Somewhere right now, a piece of Congo's earth is powering the device you're using to watch this. If that thought is worth sitting with for a second longer, a like tells us it landed, and helps this story reach someone else who's never once considered where their phone's battery actually came from. What, then, do we owe the people who dug it out? That question doesn't end when this video does. It travels the same way this country's minerals travel, into pockets, into batteries, into daily lives thousands of miles from Kolwezi's red slopes. Whether it's remembered along the way is, in the end, up to us. If you want to keep following that question with us, subscribe, because there's another country out there right now, sitting on its own hidden fortune, waiting for its turn to be understood. And before you go, what surprised you most about Congo? Tell us in the comments, because we read every one, and your answer might just decide which country we uncover next.